What if I told you that bird poop once started a war, enslaved thousands of people, and accidentally helped cause the Irish Potato Famine? This is the story of Guano. Guano is the accumulated excrement of seabirds, piled up over centuries on desert islands off Peru's Pacific coast. In the 19th century, the world decided it needed it desperately. To understand why, you need to understand something about soil, empires, and what happens when global markets treat a living ecosystem like a warehouse. What is this video about? It's not just poop, it's about environmental history. Before we get to empires and wars, we need to understand where guano actually comes from. Off Peru's coast runs one of the most productive marine ecosystems on the planet. A cold ocean current, the Humboldt Current, pushes nutrient-rich water up the deep sea. That feeds enormous plankton blooms. Anchovies eat that plankton. Seabirds eat those anchovies, and the birds deposit their waste on offshore desert islands, where there's no rain to wash it away. Over centuries, this accumulates in the most powerful natural fertilizer on the planet, pure concentrated nitrogen and phosphorus. Up to 30, 40, and 100 feet in some places. Guano is not just a rock you dig off the ground. It is the product of a living ecosystem. Warm the water, overfish the anchovies, scare off the birds, and the whole chain collapses. Ecologists call this a tightly coupled marine terrestrial ecosystem. Every link depends on one another, so living systems have limits. That idea is the spine of the story of guano. Humans have known about guano for a long time. Andean farmers were collecting seabird excrement from the islands and coastal outcroppings of Peru for at least 5,000 years. They call it Huanu, or the word guano, which comes from the Quechua language of the Andes. Now, the Inca Empire did not just use guano, rather, they had protected it. They restricted access to the islands and made disturbing the birds a federal offense punishable by death. This was a managed resource embedded in the local agricultural system, so it was vital that the inseparable fertilizer was heavily guarded. This earlier phase matters because it shows a different kind of relationship with the natural world. There's no extinction, stewardship, or lack thereof. The resource was very renewable because people using it treated it that way. They understood that it was a living system, and that came first. The relationship ends in the 19th century, but replaces it is a story of modern extractivism. In 1802, the Prussian geographer Alexander von Humboldt brought guano to European scientific attention. Europe's agricultural soils were far exhausted from centuries of intensive farming. Crop yields were failing. And when someone arrives with the name and location of a substance that could cause dramatic increases in wheat, corn, and cotton, there was a flurry of not just scientific interest, but imperial interest. This is a pattern that defines Latin American environmental history. The region gets identified as a resource zone for outside markets. Silver, gold, sugar, timber. Guano now? The logic is always similar. When there's something valuable, extraction follows. Peru nationalized the guano trade, and the Chicana Islands became the center of global commodity. By the 1850s, Peru was exporting hundreds of thousands of tons per year to Britain, the United States, Germany, and the Netherlands. The United States, still, wanted its own supply so badly that Congress passed the Guano Islands Act of 1856, allowing American citizens to claim any uninhabited Guano island across the Pacific and Caribbean. Some are still in U.S. possession today. This is ecological imperialism in practice, when the nutrients of one ecosystem are extracted and shipped to sustain agricultural growth somewhere else, all backed by political and military prowess. Extractivism is not just conducive to landscapes, it also encompasses human labor. And on the Chicana Islands, the labor system was a catastrophe. The guano was mined by hand, picks, shovels, sacks, all choking ammonia dust under the Pacific sun. The work destroyed the lungs, and initially it was done by enslaved black laborers. Following the abolition, thousands of men were coerced from Pacific Islands and southern China. Many were deceived, told they were traveling to California for the gold rush, but instead arrived on a desert island with no way home. Working conditions included flogging, starvation, extremely high rates of suicide followed. The destruction of the ecosystem and the destruction of workers are not separate stories. They are the same logic: extract everything, nothing counts. This is what environmental ethics is pushing back against. Who counts morally? During the guano boom, the answer was nobody. The answer was always profit. The boom had a simple problem. Nobody was managing it. The Peruvian government collected royalties, but failed to regulate how much was extracted or protect bird colonies that produced the guano. The deposits that had taken centuries to accumulate were stripped just within decades. And when Chilean sodium nitrate deposits were discovered in the 1870s, which offered cheaper synthetic alternatives, the demand for Peruvian guano collapsed almost overnight. The War of the Pacific would follow between the years of 1879 and 1883. Chile invaded coastal Bolivia and Peru to seize parts of the guano salt pepper resources. Bolivia lost its entire coastline, and the resource had not only been depleted, it had triggered a war. The 20th century delivered the second round of destruction. Guano production depends on the Humboldt Current, keeping Pacific waters cold and nutrient-rich. But with the passage of the El Niño climate cycle, those waters periodically warm. Beginning with catastrophic events of the 1925 El Niño cycle, it caused the anchovy population to crash repeatedly. And with no fish to eat, seabirds starved in massive numbers. At the same time, Peru became the world's largest fish meal producer, and by the mid-20th century, industrially harvesting the same anchovies that fed the birds, grounding them into protein supplements for livestock and other countries. The fish that had held the entire food chain together became a vacuum. Together, climate disruption and overfishery made recovery of the bird colonies nearly impossible. Seabird populations fell to an estimated 53 million in the late 1800s to around 4 million by 2011. Peruvian guano exports ceased entirely. This is what it looks like when a tightly coupled ecosystem finally gives out under sustained extractive pressure. Guano's history does not end in collapse. In the 1910s, Peru attempted to rebuild the industry through conservation-based management, working with foreign ornithologists to protect bird habitats, limit extraction sessions, and give islands more time to recover. It was one of the earliest examples of state-led ecological management and stewardship of a biological resource anywhere in the world. It came too late to reverse the damage, though, but it points to something important. The knowledge exists to manage this sustainably. The Incas had done it for centuries. The tools of conservation were already available. What was missing was the willingness to treat the living system as something that mattered, beyond its immediate market value. The gap between knowing how to manage a living system sustainably and choosing to not is exactly what environmental ethics tries to address. There is a difference between instrumental value, something matters because it's useful to us, and intrinsic value. Something matters because it exists. Guano's boom traded seabirds, the anchovies, the marine ecosystem, and the workers as purely instrumental. When they stopped being profitable, they stopped mattering. Nobody asked whether the living systems deserved consideration of its own terms. Nobody asked what we owe to nature itself or the future people who would inherit a depleted ecosystem. Guano is a renewable resource made non-renewable through mismanagement. The birds are still out there, the Humboldt current still flows, the ecosystem could still produce. What was not renewable was the extractive logic, the colonial and capitalist assumptions that a living system is a mine, and mines exist to be emptied. That logic did not begin with guano and did not end with it either. It is the logic of silver extraction at the Potsy, or of sugarcane monoculture in the Caribbean, or gold in Serra Pelada. Latin American environmental history is, in large part, the history of what happens when the outside world repeatedly decides that this region exists to supply it. Environmental history exists to show us how these systems were built, who they were built for, and what it would take to build them differently. Guano is a good place to start. It is, after all, a pretty hard thing to ignore.